lockdown time. So this is the last talk of this year only. Next year we will have more amazing talks. So I welcome you all to our online observatory event, which is called Night Under the Stars. And generally we are a bunch of PhD students and we try to explain our research or some topic in physics in some simple terms and try to interact with you guys. And the idea is to answer some curiosity which you have, and while answering those curiosities, it might happen that we might get some idea in our research. So today's topic is a bit more general. I would try to not keep it that physicsy, but it would be more about the amazing contribution and the struggle that the women physicists have to go through while doing research in physics. Okay, so there will be just like these four, let's say, main topics which we will discuss. So first, I will give you some basic introduction about what fundamental forces are and how we sort of see things, because that is important, because right now obviously you are seeing me through a visible spectrum, but I will go more into it. And then I will talk about the particle physics ladies. So there will be these two, Marie Curie and Lisa Meitner. Then I will go to the lady of the cosmos, so that would be Vera Rubin and Reuben Scott. And then in the end there would be a mysterious lady, and I hope by that time you are not asleep, because that would be a bit more physicsy stuff, but that is also a very important contribution was done by a very important female physicist, but she was not a physicist, she was a mathematician, but more on that later. Okay, so basic thing is that recently some of you might have celebrated Christmas, or if not, then you might have bought a cake. And then if you just try to figure out that, okay, what is the smallest individual particle in the cake, or let's say in this water droplet. So we know that a water droplet is made of hydrogen atoms. So you have like 2 atoms of hydrogen and 1 of oxygen. But then you want to go in more deeper, that okay, what are these atoms made of? So these atoms are made of a nucleus, and a nucleus has your protons and neutrons, and they are surrounded by the electrons. So electrons are generally called your elementary particles, elementary being that they cannot be broken down further. But inside the nucleons, you have the protons and the neutrons. So protons and neutrons are made up of further particles which are called quarks. So quarks are the elementary particles. So okay, this thing is sorted, that okay, the elementary particles are quarks and electrons. And now you want to understand that okay, how do these particles interact with each other? If there is one drop of molecule and there is another drop of molecule, what type of interaction takes place? But before that, we have to understand something which is called the scale of the physics. Now what do I mean by scale? So if you focus on the image on the right, so this longitudinal image, so if you are seeing let's say if you see a water droplet, so that scale is about like 1 millimeter. Then you go deeper, I mean you can take a microscope or see things. Then you will go at the level of the atoms, so that would be like 10 to the power minus 7 millimeters. So this is like a very small scale. Then you go more inside that, okay, I want to probe more deeper. Then you will go into quarks and gluons, which are being studied in the Large Hadron Collider right now in CERN. So these are 10 to the power minus 12 millimeters. And then if you want to probe individual quarks, then that would be 10 to the power minus 15 millimeters. Now why am I defining this scale is because at different scale, the physics which is being applied is sort of different. So whatever I have discussed right now right now is when you are probing the particles, when you are on the scale of the particles, what you are probing is called the particle physics. And on the left, if you see this, so this again, there is this horizontal line in meters. So 10 to the power minus 15 meters or 10 to the power minus 6, these are like very small scale. So you need microscopes or you need like colliders to see what is happening. So this all is governed by something which is called particle physics or nuclear physics. Then as the scale increases, so if you come to like, let's say 10 to the power 11 meters, so here the scale is different and the different scale of physics is used. So here you have Newtonian mechanics. Then you have the Milky Way galaxy, which is more bigger, and so on and so forth. And also, once you know about scale of physics, you have to also encounter the particle zoo. So out of all the particles in the universe, they can be broadly characterized into these two sets, which you can see. So first is the fermions. So these are the things that matter is made of. So before I showed you that okay, electrons and quarks are the elementary particles. So these particles have mass. So these are the quarks and the leptons. So these are called fermions, which make up the matter. And then there are the particles which mediate the forces, which we will study about. So these are called bosons. So generally there are four fundamental interactions. The one is gravity, one is electromagnetism, one is called weak force, and one is called strong force. So the particles which mediate these forces are known as bosons, and they act on the particles which have mass in them, and they are generally known as fermions. So there are four fundamental forces which we know right now in our current observable universe. One is gravity, which is obviously the apple is falling down, or how Earth and Moon interact. Then there is the electromagnetism, and this force is between the electrons, or even right now if you are sitting in a chair or table, how you are sitting or how you are walking, because the particles have this electromagnetic force between them, and that is how you characterize this. Then you have the strong force. Strong force are when you go more deep into the nucleus. So this is at the level of quarks and all. And weak forces are there when you have radioactive decay. So I will just broadly classify this because this is how we will go on later. So once again, so you have strong forces which binds the nucleus. You have electromagnetic forces which binds the atoms. You have the weak forces which are generally observed in radioactive decay, and each of these forces have a force mediating particle. So photon is the mediating particle for electromagnetic forces, gluon is for strong forces, and these bosons are for radioactive forces. Now all these three forces are generally explained by something which is called the standard model of physics. So this is explained by your quantum mechanics and special relativity, which together is generally known as particle physics. And then there is this gravitational force. So now the scale of the physics is different, and this is explained by your classical Newtonian gravitation, or more accurately by Einstein's general theory of relativity. And physicists are trying to understand that okay, how these four forces can be explained by a single theory. And physicists actually generally believe that long back when the universe was, let's say, was in the initial stages of its birth, all these forces were together. So there was this unified force, and as the universe progressed, these forces got sort of separate. So you had gravitation, strong, electromagnetic, and weak. So we are right now at this frontier of physics, and physicists believe that okay, sometime long back in the Big Bang, all these forces would have been one. And generally they hope that the unification hope would be that okay, the general relativity, which is the theory of large scale structures or something, this might combined with quantum mechanics, which is the theory of very small particles, and you might get a unified theory. But success has not been received that much, but anyways. Okay, now I will go explain you that whatever you are seeing right now, so right now, okay, you are seeing your laptop screen or mobile screen, so there is actually a photon which is going from the screen to you, and this is how you are seeing. But that photon is actually in the visible spectrum of what is called the electromagnetic spectrum. So electromagnetic spectrum is actually very large. So when you have very high frequency photons, they are the radioactive elements. Then you have the X-ray machines, then you have the sun. This is the visible spectrum which we all see. Then the TV remotes and the mobile phones and everyone, they are in the microwave range, and this is how the electromagnetic spectrum works. Now when you are observing objects in the universe from different sky positions, or from, let's say, different distances, you need these telescopes. So there are some telescopes or observatories which are down on the ground, which are over here, and there are some which are orbiting around the Earth, and they are also collecting data and giving you information about the structures in the universe and etc. So depending on which wavelength it is, so it can either be radio, infrared, optical, ultraviolet, or X-rays, you design your instruments and they observe the thing which you want to see. Now generally if you have a if there is a clear sky and if you want to see the Milky Way galaxy, so at the night you can if there is a clear sky, you might see a Milky Way galaxy like this. But imagine for 1 minute that you are Superman, or let's say Superwoman, and you can see all the visible light. So right now the light which is coming to you from this Milky Way is invisible, but once you are Superman or Superwoman, you can probe all the wavelengths. You can probe the radio waves, you can probe the microwaves, and you can see the infrared and so and so. So how will this Milky Way look? It will look somehow like this. So you will see the same Milky Way. This is the optical or the visible wavelength which you will see. You will also see it in infrared, you will also see it in X-ray, or you will also see it in gamma ray, and different images will tell you a different story because it will tell you more about the object you are looking into. So now, since we have packed up with this knowledge of what fundamental forces are and how we see things, we move on to the contributions of the female physicists. So first, I will discuss about the particle physics ladies. So there is a disclaimer here that for the current presentation, I will take that particle physics are at the same level they are at the same level as the nuclear physics, but my fellow physicists will kill me. But anyways, for the sake of this presentation, it would be fine. So there is a phenomena in physics which is known as radioactivity. So generally, whenever you heard radioactivity, either you would remember the World War II where the atomic bombs were dropped, or you would remember the Chernobyl disaster TV series. Anyway, so let's just look into radioactivity a little. So radioactivity is that it's nothing that sometimes atoms are not happy with just being themselves. So as and when the protons and the neutrons in the nucleus of an atom, they are more and more, it becomes unstable. And every atom, it seeks to be as stable as possible. This is what we observe in the nature. So in case of a radioactive decay, the instability occurs when there is an imbalance in the number of protons and neutrons in the atomic nucleus. And what actually happens is that that radioactive atom, it emits some energy and a particle and the radiation. So generally when we have all seen the periodic table. So on the top you have these lighter elements, hydrogen, helium, carbon, nitrogen, which constitutes the most of the living organisms. But towards the end you have those particles which are radioactive, means they are not stable and they generally decay. So what happens is that these are some form of nuclear reactions. So this is the transformation of one type of element into another, and this is the basis of nuclear reactions, which causes one nucleus to change into a different nucleus. Because what is happening is that a number of protons and neutrons, they make up the element, and if one or the other goes out, then you would get a different element. That is what is happening. So an unstable nucleus will decay into a more stable configuration, and I hope you can see this, the red cursor, but will do so in a few specific ways by emitting certain particles or certain forms of electromagnetic energy. So whenever the particles are released, so this thing which is called radioactive decay will happen in either of these three forms. And the thing is, this is a very probabilistic this is of very probabilistic nature, and you do not know which radiation will happen. So either alpha decay will happen. In alpha decay, as you can see, so there is the radioactive nucleus and alpha particle goes on. So alpha particle is nothing but this helium 2 plus particle. And then there can also be a beta decay radiation where an electron is emitted out. So here in beta decay, your electrons are being emitted out, and then you have a gamma decay where a photon is emitted and the particle does not change state, but it gets excited. Now generally we used to study in 12th class and all that, okay, alpha decay, they can be easily stopped by paper, beta decay, they can easily be stopped by an aluminum sheet, but this gamma radiation is obviously, we know that's very dangerous because it cannot be stopped even if you have like layers and layers of lead. And who was the person responsible for all this thing which I told was Marie Skłodowska. There is a Polish L cut, so it's Skłodowska-Curie. So she was a Polish and a naturalized French physicist and a chemist who pioneered in the research of radioactivity. So initially she was born in Warsaw, and she had a very difficult childhood because there, obviously at the time of the war and everything, much of her father's wealth and all were lost, and she initially used to work as a governess. And so she had this arrangement with her sister that once her sister is well settled, then she will come and get enrolled in a higher education, so that's why she was working as a governess. But when she reached that place, the tuition fees was too much, and initially she was unable to enroll in higher education because she was a woman. But in any ways, adversities aside, so in 1903, she won the Nobel Prize with Pierre Curie, which was her husband, and Henry Becquerel. So this is the first Nobel Prize she won for radioactivity. And then again, using the technique she invented for isolating radioactive isotopes, she won the 1911 Nobel Prize in chemistry for discovering two elements. So one was named polonium, so this is after her home nation, which is Poland, so this is polonium, and radium. And she was also, after this research and after getting these prizes, she was finally able to apply for being a professor in a university, and she was the first woman to become a professor at the University of Paris. And the element she had discovered over here, radium, it had the use that, because what is happening is that this radiation is coming out, and similar thing happens with radium. And in the war at that time, at World War I, when a bullet or some sharp utensil, sharp piece used to go, some sharp object used to go inside somebody's body, and at that time there was no technology used to see that, okay, is there a bullet or where is the bullet. So she, Madame Curie, and her daughter Irene, they made mobile radiography units during the World War I, and they used this radium in order to help in the World War I, in order to help the soldiers recover fast. And this is a family legacy of 5 Nobel Prizes, because 2 Nobel Prizes were won by Marie Curie, one by Pierre, and then later her daughter Irene, she also discovered an element. She and her husband also got the Nobel Prize. Okay, since we are discussing about radioactivity, there is another concept which we learn in our school, is called nuclear fission. So this generally happens when things break. So you have a uranium atom which has like many neutrons and protons. It is very heavy. So if you bombard it with a neutron, it will decay into more stable particles which are known as chromium and barium, and there is another neutrons. But the important fact is that there is a lot of energy is released. So generally in a nuclear reactor, a neutron is observed into a nucleus over here, and this splits the nucleus into 2 large fragments called the daughter nucleus. And the important thing is that a lot of energy is released, and the basic idea is that this actually is a chain reaction, because these neutrons in the reaction will again interact with these, and you can see that it's a chain reaction. But the important thing is that in a nuclear reactor there are these control rods which control the nuclear fission. But as you know that the bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, they were uncontrolled, so there was no control rods or something. There was just this explosion and the chain reaction which went on and on. And the person who is generally referred to as the mother of the atomic bomb is Lisa Meitner. So she was an Austrian and a Swedish physicist who contributed to the discoveries of the element protactinium and nuclear fission. So she came up with this. And in 1905, so Meitner became the first woman from the University of Vienna and the second in the world to earn a doctorate in physics. And she also suffered a lot of, let's say, sexism in academics. So in Berlin, in Germany, where she was a physics professor and a department head at the Kaiser-Wilhelm Institute, she was the first woman to become a full professor of physics in Germany. But she lost these positions in 1930s because of the anti-Jewish laws of the Nazi Germany. And in 1938, she fled to Sweden, where she lived for many years. Ultimately, she became a Swedish citizen. So she was originally from Germany, and Einstein famously called her as the German Marie Curie. So I hope you can see this image, and the only thing odd over here is that there are only 2 women. One is Lisa Meitner and one over here. So at that time it was obviously a male dominated field over here. Women were not allowed to carry on research, and even though she was a professor over here, she was not paid that much, and she was the first woman to receive a habilitation in physics in the Prussian regime. So about her research, now let's go to talk about her research. So in mid 1938, Meitner and there was this chemist called Otto Hahn and Fritz Strassmann, they found that bombarding thorium the thorium is another radioactive element with neutrons. It produces different isotopes. So isotopes is let's say isotope is like a particle which has a different number of neutrons. So like carbon is an atom, so carbon also comes in different forms like carbon 12, carbon 14. They all are carbon, just that the number of neutrons are different. And what happened is that Hans and Strassmann, they later in the year showed that the isotopes of barium could be formed by bombardment of the uranium. So there were two groups. One was the chemist working on the chemist Hahn and Strassmann, and then there was the physicist Meitner, who we are discussing. She was also working. So in the late December, Meitner and Frisch, they worked out the phenomena of such a splitting process. So Otto Hahn and Fritz Spiessner, they obviously got the result, but why the things or why this splitting process was happening, this was figured out by Meitner and Frisch. Meitner is Lisa Meitner. So in their report in February issue of 1939, they gave it the name the fission. So that's how nuclear fission came into the picture. Of course, the theory and all was based on Einstein's the famous formula E is equals to mc square, but it was Lisa Meitner who used that formula in order to explain the findings of Otto and Fritz. So this principle led to the development of the first atomic bomb during the World War II, and subsequently other nuclear weapons and nuclear reactors. And now let's say the not so funny thing is that, so Otto Hahn and Fritz Strassmann, they found out these elements and everything, but she did not share the 1944 Nobel Prize in Chemistry for nuclear fission, which was awarded exclusively to her longtime collaborator Otto Hahn. So even though Otto Hahn and everyone, they found out that nuclear fission is happening, but the theory and the exact calculations and why this thing is happening, why this energy is coming out. So what Otto Hahn discovered was, okay, there is this krypton coming out and barium coming out, but the reason that why this energy is coming and why this uranium splits into two daughter nuclei, why this happens was due to Meitner, and this was never recognized. So, and according to the Nobel Prize archive, she was nominated 19 times for Nobel Prize in Chemistry between 1924 and 1948, and 29 times for Nobel Prize in Physics between 1937 and 1965. Though later she was conferred many prizes and all, but at that time Nobel committee was, let's say, not that well balanced. And since we were talking about breaking of the nucleus, there is another term, there is another feature which is called nuclear fusion. So here is when two atoms come together. So you have two hydrogen atoms, they come together to form helium, and this also releases a large form of energy. So initially I used to think that, okay, nuclear fission is possible because that has been done, and fusion I had no idea about research, but when I was making this presentation I came across that that there is a laboratory in Korea which is the K-star fusion reactor. It created an artificial sun only for 20 seconds long, and the temperature of that sun, obviously it was very small and all, it was 100 million degrees, and the temperature at the center of the sun is only 15 million. So if fusion comes into the future, it would obviously be let's say a pollution free source of energy, because in nuclear fission there are these radioactive decays which one has to take care of. Okay, now we were till now we were discussing about the ladies in the particle physics regime. Now let's move on to the ladies of the cosmos. Okay, so I will now talk about galaxies and how a very important person who studied the orbital motion of the stars in the galaxies led to a very important let's say discovery which physicists are still trying to discover. Okay, so the ballet of galaxies. So galaxies are nothing but gravitationally bound systems of stars and stellar remnants, interstellar gas, dust and dark matter. The size of the galaxies are generally a few hundred million, like 10 to the power 8 stars to 10 to the power 14. So these are like big galaxies, and galaxies come in different forms. So they are irregular, spiral, but the images are beautiful. And this is a galaxy, a spiral galaxy, NGC 44. It is in the constellation Coma. Berenices, and it's about 55,000 light years in diameter and approximately 60 million light years from Earth. Light year is a new word, so you can see that 1 light year is 10 to the power 12 kilometers, so obviously this is very far away. And why this ballet dancer is here, so if you can probably think about this question, that is she rotating at the same speed at the all time. So okay, here she has some speed, but you can see that towards the end, like right now, she spins very fast. So keep that thing in mind, because that would be important to understand the further concepts. So generally we used to do this experiment, or you can do it also, that you can take a stone or a coin and you can tie it to a ring, and if you rotate it, you will see that if you have to keep this thread, let's say, in a plane, and if you have to keep it at a constant plane, not droopy like this, so you will come to know that you need more force to keep it moving around fast. And now the idea is that if things move slowly, so if things are moving slowly, then it means that a relatively smaller force is acting. Nothing great over here. But how is this concept related, let's say, how to apply this concept to first, let's say, solar system. So in context of gravity, because solar system and everything, there are these massive particles and gravity is the main force over here, this string would be replaced by the gravity of the sun. So all the planets are revolving around sun due to the gravity of the sun. And there are only two important things in the picture. One is the mass of the object, and one is the distance from the object. And one can conclude that if the planet is orbiting slowly, it is actually very far. So so for this system right now, the 99% of the mass of the solar system, you can assume that it is concentrated at the sun, because sun is really massive. And let's say if you plan to mark the speed of, let's say, Pluto or Neptune, so these are outer planets, let's say I consider Pluto as a planet for now. So when I will plot its graph of velocity versus distance, so Pluto will have obviously a very small speed and a very great distance. You can see that the speed is very low. Then you will go on to Neptune, which will have a slightly greater speed and a lesser distance. Then as you will come closer, you can see that the velocity is increasing. And it makes sense, because here the velocity is that the orbital velocity. So you know that Mars takes around 88 days, or not Mars, Mercury takes around 88 days to revolve around the sun. So as you can see that when you go far, the planets take more time to revolve around the sun. So basically the plot for solar system of a velocity and distance would be something like this. And now the idea is to understand what would be for galaxies. So here we come to the concept of galaxy rotation curve. So galaxy rotation curve is nothing but it is a graph of orbital speed versus the orbital radius. So as it is in the solar system, that sun holds all the planets and they are revolving around and etc. In galaxies also, gravity holds the objects in the orbit, and the speed of the orbit is related to the amount of the mass interior to the orbit. So if you have a galaxy, the amount of matter which is at the center will determine how the things are revolving. This is a basic intuition. So if the mass is at the center, then speed will decrease with the distance. What it actually means that you can refer to the example of the solar system. As you go far from the sun, like the Pluto orbit, the speed sort of decreases, right? So in the galaxies also, whenever we take images or whenever we see things, the most luminous parts are at the center. So one can imagine that, okay, for galaxies also the graph should be like this. What I mean is that the orbital speed of these clouds over here, which are very far, should be slow because they are far from the center. It turns out that it's not the case. And why is it so? Is because of Vera Florence Cooper Rubin. So she was an American astronomer who pioneered the work on galaxy rotation rates. So she uncovered the discrepancy between the predicted angular motion of galaxies and the observed motion by studying the galaxy rotation curves. And this is known as the galaxy rotation problem. Just to remind that right now what we are thinking that, okay, for the solar system we get like this. Now we are trying to understand the question that is it so for the galaxies, because galaxies also have matter, stars and everything. So the objects which are farther from the galaxy will have a slower speed. But what actually Vera Rubin found that this was not the case. And why this is so, I'll go in the next slide. But first, she also struggled with some obviously problems in her academic career. So first of all, she ignored the advice she had received from a high school science teacher to avoid scientific career and become an artist. She finally joined a career, and I think she was the only astronomer graduate at that time. She attempted to enroll in a graduate program in Princeton but was barred due to her gender. So because in Princeton only after 27 years women were allowed to attend the college. And now returning to the problem. So remember that this plot. But what Vera Rubin actually observed is that the speeds are essentially constant with increasing distance. So on a dry and clear night at the Kitt Peak Observatory in the mountains of southern Arizona, Rubin was closely observing the spectra of stars from Andromeda galaxy to determine their velocity. So what is happening is that the speed, what she observed was that speeds are essentially constant with increasing distance. So now the basic intuition is that, okay, if the things which are moving at the outskirts, if they have constant speed, it means that much more mass has to be there at the center in order to have its effect on the outskirts. So to keep the speeds constant, there needs to be more mass throughout the system. But when we observe the galaxies and everything, all the mass is concentrated over here. And this is the luminous mass which we observe. So what is actually happening? So in 1970s, when Vera Rubin uncovered a discrepancy between observed galactic rotation speed and that predicted by the visible mass of stars and gas, the idea came that there is some form of unseen dark matter over here. So I have written this in color coding, let's say a rainbow font or something, but there is a big exclamation mark. Is that it has been theorized that, okay, there is this dark matter in the galaxies which is causing the outer stars or outer things to rotate quickly, but we know, let's say, next to nothing about dark matter, because it does not interact electromagnetically, and it only interacts gravitationally. So dark matter is a form of matter which accounts for 85% of the matter in the universe. Its presence is implied in a variety of astrophysical observations, so via the galaxy rotation curves and the galaxy lensing or the structure formation. It is called dark because it does not appear to interact with the electromagnetic field, and it was Rubin's calculations which showed that the galaxies contain at least 5 to 10 times as much as dark matter as ordinary matter. Okay, so this is the simulation which is running over here. So generally you can see that let's say the stars and everything which are moving outside, they have to move fast enough in order to have the plot which Vera Rubin obtained. And this is only because it has been theorized that there is some form of matter called dark matter over here, because luminous matter does not account for this. By luminous matter I mean that if you are so luminous matter is all the matter which is present over there, and if you try to plot the orbital speed of the outer stars over here with the amount of luminous matter you are seeing, it would mean that these stars and everything, they would fly apart. But this is not what we are seeing. We are seeing that these outer stars and everything, they are revolving around this center more quickly. So there is this theorized dark matter which is there and which is causing it, and this was discovered by Vera Rubin. Okay, a bit about radio astronomy. So generally when we see things, as I told you earlier, we see in visible light and let's say in infrared and everything. So suppose you are observing a galaxy in visible light, obviously the image is beautiful and you can see it in different wavelengths, but you can also see it in radio wavelengths. It actually gives you, let's say, more knowledge about how the star formation is happening or how the galaxies are rotating. Even if you can, you can even see the sun in different wavelengths. And I think, funnily or not, if you see the sun, let's say, you will not look at directly, your eyes will be hurt, but if you see the visible diameter of the sun and if you see the sun in radio wavelength, it is actually different. So because there are some particles which are emitting in radio wavelengths, and that's why the size is increased. And in order to detect these radio wavelengths, there are these many ground-based telescopes which are made. Few are there in our observatory, and recently there was I think previously one of the largest radio telescopes dish, which was in Puerto Rico, and but it got destroyed. So farewell Arecibo, we will miss you. But now the biggest dish radio telescope is in China, I guess. And these are important because they help you discover the amazing properties of galaxies and the things in the universe. And who was responsible for pioneer in radio physics and radio astronomy was Ruby Payne Scott. So initially she used to work at a cancer research institute, and she determined that the magnetism of the earth had little or no effect on the vital processes of the living beings on earth. At that time she was a physics graduate, but she could not get a job in physics that time. But later she got an engineering job, and she experimented with the new antennas and carried out measurements and developed the methods for evaluating the data. It is she who observed the radiation, the bursts of radiation on the sun and in the radio wave range, and was involved in the world's first measurement with a radio interferometer. And after let's say many temporary positions, she got a job as a astronomer in one of the observatories in Australia. And you can see that she was the only female present over here. And although she was originally hired as a librarian, her work quickly expanded to leading the measurements of the laboratory and performing electrical engineering research. Okay, so I have not exactly about to end the presentation, but now is the final part. So spoiler alert that it might get a little crazy. But anyways, we have to appreciate what this person did also. Okay, so let's say me and you, we meet someplace, and I also don't know physics, you also don't know physics, and we are looking at the three images at the top. So we might agree that okay, the image on the left is very beautiful, this butterfly is also okay, very nice, this, I don't know, McD burger is also, symbol is nice. But if we will ponder upon it more, we will understand that this picture is very symmetric. So if I draw a line over here, the things are reflected on each side. Similarly, if I draw a line over here, the things are reflected on this side. Similarly, over here, they are reflected on this side. Now what happens is that this symmetry which you see in nature is also very important in physics and maths, but I will talk about physics. So symmetry in physics is the concept that the properties of the particles such as atoms and molecules, they remain unchanged after being subjected to a variety of symmetry transformations or operations. It essentially means that okay, if I draw a line over here, you can see that the ore's size over here, the size of the ore on this side is same over here. Imagine that I have a mirror here, and if I have few particles over here and they are interacting, and there is some or the other forces working over here. In the symmetry of it, which means that the mirror image of it, the physical phenomena which is happening is actually physical phenomena which will happen should be the same. So this is a basic idea of symmetry. And what this symmetry tells us is it indicates some form of conservation laws. So to remind you, we have the strong, the electromagnetic, and the weak forces, and then there is gravity. So these are the four fundamental interactions, and it turns out that symmetry plays an important role in each of them, even though we have not been able to unite all these things together. So I will quickly go through this because I think I'm getting a bit late. So where there is symmetry, there is something. And since the earliest days of natural philosophy, symmetry has furnished an insight into the laws of physics and the nature of the cosmos. Why is it? Because symmetry plays a very fundamental role in the relativity and the quantum mechanics, the two very cornerstones of physics right now. So imagine you are riding a bicycle in a straight line. Now what happens is that for something moving in a straight line, there is a quantity which is conserved. Conserved means that there is no leakage of something into the well, that's not a very good word, but I hope you understand what conserved means. So if you are moving on a straight line, then there is an implicit thing which says that there is conservation of linear momentum. Okay, this is one thing. Now imagine you are throwing a bowling ball straight. So one can also study this motion and come to the conclusion that a motion is symmetric under translation. So this ball, when it is moving straight, you can say that it is symmetric under translation, and this will also hint that something is conserved. So these two things appear different, but they are one and the same thing. Why? Because this leads to a conclusion that there are certain laws which are the conservation laws, conservation of linear momentum or angular momentum something, they are not affected when their geometric coordinates including time are changed by means of symmetry operations. What I mean is, if you are going from A to B, your linear momentum is conserved. It's the same if I do this thing is in reverse, meaning if you come from B to A when I reverse the time, or even if you go from B to A, this linear momentum quantity would be conserved. So hence the physical laws, they actually remain they remain valid at all places and times in the universe, and symmetry tells us a bit more about it. Okay, so what is this symmetry which I am talking, and I hope you are not asleep by now. So a symmetry is of a physical system is a feature of the system that is preserved or it remains unchanged under some transformation. So if there is some reflection happening, or if I am doing a calculation or an experiment reversed in time, there is something which remains constant. So there are two things which there could be a continuous transformation like this rotation of a circle, or there could be these discrete transformations which are the rotations of a polygon. Now why this is important? This is important because in particle physics there are these considerations of symmetries which can be used to derive conservation laws and determine which particle interaction will take place or not. So with these symmetry laws one can find out that okay, this reaction will not happen. If this reaction will not happen, then this such and such particle cannot be created. So this is how it helps. And the standard model of particle physics, I will just say few words. That standard model of particle physics incorporates the strong, weak, and the electromagnetic force. Gravity is let's say not compatible. So the standard model of particle physics has three related natural near symmetries. It states, bit more technical, but I will repeat it 2 times. It states that the universe in which we live should be indistinguishable, that means you cannot differentiate, from another one where a certain type of change is introduced. So this is called as the CPT theorem, which is called the charge, parity and time. It just says that if there is a reaction happening, or if there is a physical phenomena happening, if I change the charge of the particle, the parity, by parity I mean the reflection, going from x to y, you can go from y to x, or if I reverse the time, then the whole thing will remain unchanged. And there is also an important contribution of a woman, Madame Wu. So these type of reactions, the weak decays are exactly which we were doing, the nuclear fission, the radioactive decays. So these reactions, they do not follow parity, and this was actually experimentally confirmed by Madame Wu. But okay, she is not the main character. The main character is Emmy Noether. So she was a German mathematician who made many important contributions to abstract algebra, and she discovered these Noether theorem. So all these things which I am speaking about symmetry, that symmetry gives an invariance thing, or it gives you some conservation laws, this is based on Noether's theorem, which is the fundamental in mathematical physics. And she was one of the only 2 women in the university of 968 students. So Noether was allowed to only audit the classes of physics rather than participate fully, and she was required to have the permission of individual professors whose lectures she wished to attend, because at that time women were not allowed. So after the PhD, she taught at the University of Erlangen's Mathematical Institute without pay. I should have bold this thing, and occasionally substituting her father when he was too ill to lecture. And she used to share postcards with her professor while discussing abstract algebra. So Noether theorem states that every symmetry of a physical system has a corresponding law. If you are moving in a straight line, linear momentum is conserved. So I can vice versa say that if linear momentum is conserved, then there is something or the other moving in a straight line. This is a way to understand it. And an important example of symmetry in physics is that the speed of light has the same value in all the frame of references. So one is the special theory of relativity, where your space and time come together, and I will request my colleagues to put the link of the talk where I have talked about special relativity. And also you have general relativity, where you have space, time and matter together, which is the final theory of gravity which we have. That also uses Noether's theorem extensively. So Einstein wrote shortly after her death that Noether was the most significant creative mathematical genius thus far produced since the higher education of women began. Okay, I am about to end. So who are we? We are a group of PhD students, and this is our event, Night Under the Stars. We all are PhD students at the Astronomical Observatory. Right now we are working from home, but it still looks beautiful. We are at the Jagiellon University in Krakow. We are different PhD students working on different topics. This is me, and every once in a month we have this event where we talk about physics related talk and help you understand it. So to conclude, I would like to say, first of all, apologies to all the other amazing women physicists for not including them, and hope I didn't bore you to that. And thank you, because of you guys, I found out that chocolate chip cookie is discovered by Ruth Wakefield. I had no idea, but since I was making this presentation, I came across this. And an advance Happy New Year from the Night Under the Stars family. And I'm open to questions as you look into this GIF. This GIF is also interesting because initially it shows the, let's say, the solar system, then you zoom out, then there are galaxies, then there are cluster of galaxies, then there is the cosmological scale, and then finally there is this observed universe, but we have still many questions to go. So okay, I will wait for a while because there is a lag in the questions which we get, so I will check the comment section and see if there are any questions. Okay, there is a question that why the last image of the sun was elongated. So this is an important question because I was also trying to talk to radio people over here, because I think the visible because the surface of the sun is not, there is this nuclear fission reaction happening at the core and at the border. I think there are these plasmas, and then there are these bubbles which are bursting on the surface, right? So this plasma and everything, it actually extends more than the visible wavelength. This is what I could understand, but I would ask, I think, Sagar to explain this. But don't worry, if you have any other question, just type them, we will try to answer them. But yeah, it's interesting. It is an interesting question that why the last image of the sun was elongated. Because visibly when you see the image of the sun, it is shorter than what you see in the radio wavelength, but I will look more into it. Okay, I will wait for more questions if there are. Okay, I seem that there are no more questions. Only one question by Arvind. I think we'll try to answer this. I'll discuss it with Sagar. Why is it so? Because I actually forgot why is the image longer. I mean, I work on the theory side, but it's very interesting to note that why is it that the image of the sun is longer in radio wavelength. Okay, so since there are no more questions, again I wish you a happy new year, and I hope this talk gave you some example of the hurdles which were faced by the women in the field of physics. Okay, so I will end.